It's been a while since we talked about the elections that occurred in the 1900s, so let's get into the election of 1904. Since McKinley had been assassinated in 1901, Roosevelt had been in office for 3 years. He was already very popular among common folk, even before his ascension into office, and only gained even more popularity throughout the remainder of his term. And thanks to the death of McKinley's ally Mark Hanna,
What's up, bitches?
it was a no-brainer for him to be the Republican nominee for the presidential race of '04. The conservative Bourbon Democrats gained control of the Democratic Party, so Bryan, the Democratic nominee of the 1900 election, did not have enough popularity in his party to gain the nomination this time. Instead, the nomination went to Alton Parker, a conservative Democrat. Now, Roosevelt and Parker differed little when it came to actual politics. Roosevelt had already established himself as a capable leader, with his success in foreign affairs, firm stance against monopolies, and continued economic growth, though that last one was rarely in complete control of the president anyway. He was also far more charismatic. There were a few differences, though. While both parties believed in the fair treatment of Filipinos and their eventual liberation, Parker was marginally more anti-imperialist. Overall, they were both very centrist men. The conservatives of the Republican Party called Roosevelt too radical, and the progressives of the Democratic Party called Parker too conservative. Overall, it was down to a contest of charisma and a test of the alliances the American people had with their party of choice. Ultimately, Roosevelt won by a landslide, even flipping the state of Missouri, which had been part of the solid South of Democratic voting states, to vote Republican. I would have agreed with just over half of my fellow Missourians that the Republican Party was a better option this time around. Liberation for the Philippines was not a viable option for either party, with both essentially saying, yes, but not now. In the meantime, we'll be nicer. Roosevelt had proven himself a capable leader with some concern for the average American over big business, something that Parker could only promise, and actions speak louder than words. For me, if the options are the same, I'd rather no change happen at all, rather than risk the other option only speaking to gain office and not having the intention of putting his plan into action. All around, this was a very boring election. God, do I wish we had these in modern day. I want boring elections and boring presidencies again. Speaking of modern American politics, you may have noticed I used some terms that you may not be familiar with. The solid South of Democratic voting states? Conservative Democrat, what? Well, you see, while the South, historically speaking, has always been more conservative, and the North has always been more progressive, the parties that supported progressive/conservative ideas have changed over time. This party switch would gradually happen over the middle of the 20th century, really starting around the 30s with the New Deal. But in 1904, this hadn't happened yet. In 1904, Democrats were the ones supporting small government, were more opposed to gender and racial equality, and overall reluctant to change, while the Republican Party assumed the opposite role. This is why sometimes you'll see stuff like, Democrats were in favor of Jim Crow, Republicans freed the slaves, and Democrats were pro-slavery. While true, this was before the party switch, and let's be honest, up until recently, very recently, neither party was particularly enthusiastic about equality for women and minorities. Conservatives have always been the ones in favor of these discriminatory and oppressive systems, and it was their party that changed. Additionally, back in the 1900s and even up until the mid-20th century, the parties were far less split, with both sides having conservatives and progressives as supporters. Back in the day, the parties had more commonalities and agreed on far more issues. While one side was more progressive and one side more conservative, according to today's standards, they were both very centrist, with many people often voting for both Republicans and Democrats depending on whose policies they favored, rather than just voting for whoever represented their chosen party. Although there were still those that voted purely out of party loyalty. Politicians themselves, even if they were within the same party, could differ greatly in their opinions on certain issues and policies that they supported. For example, you in 1904 might typically vote Republican, but your local Republican senator nominee supports the continued U.S. control over the Philippines and has no issue with the negative impacts the U.S. has on the territory and its people, while a Democratic nominee doesn't support continued U.S. involvement. Or maybe the primaries are going on and you choose to vote over one Democratic nominee over another because one is pro-big business and the other is pro-workers' rights. Nowadays, you vote for the least crazy one and cross your fingers that they win. This is why it's important to vote during your primaries, everyone.